Hello, everyone. I think we can start now. We have quite a few people who've joined in. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining in today. I'd also like to thank Nazish, Francesca, and Karishma for joining. So before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about why we're hosting this webinar today. So this webinar is part of our IFC-PBC Climate2Equal Platform. This is a program we've run last year, and then we're just in the second cycle, and we're still inducting companies. I'll share some more details about the how to sign up and what the project looks like later in the webinar. But for today, we're going to be exploring the gender climate nexus, and that's what essentially the Climate to Equal platform also focuses on. We basically work with private sector companies and help them adapt and bring in more women in their climate action initiatives. The idea behind the idea behind the Climate to Equal project, as you'll see in the webinar, is to address that women do face climate action. Women do face the brunt of climate change in a very different manner than men do, and a lot of times it's a disproportionate impact on women. So today's webinar will include some case studies, examples from Pakistan, and an international case study. We'll also talk about the gender and climate nexus, why it's so important for Pakistan as a country to address it, and also some of the barriers that exist in women's entry towards climate initiatives or actions. So before we move forward in the webinar, I would also like to mention that we'll be sharing a feedback form at the end, along with intention to pledge form. And those companies who are interested, highly recommend that you sign up for the intent to pledge, and then we'll be sharing more details via email, or we can set up a call. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nazir Sheikha, head of SERB. She'd be talking about some of the barriers that women face. Thank you, Nazir. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Safia. Hi, can everybody hear me? Yep. Okay. Let me just share my presentation. It's great to be on this webinar and, talking about our favorite topic, which is climate and gender action. It's a very important topic and because considering that Pakistan is one of the most countries most impacted by climate change, and it's also very low on the gender gap index. So, both of taking both these things in mind, it's very important to see, how each impact each other. So when we're talking about gender equality, there's no question that, gender equality and, coupling it with the crisis, there's no question that it is one of the, these are both one of the greatest, one of the greatest challenges of our time. But it's also very important to see that how, each impact each other and create a ripple effect. And, when we talk about that, it's very, there's a lot of recognition now on this ripple effect, in especially all of those global frameworks out there. So the main global framework, the UNFCCC, which basically aligns countries to start working on climate change. It also, in the last 10 years, has also updated its frameworks to include, yeah, the impact, the differential impact of women and men with the respect to climate change. And it's done that in two ways. It's basically in its document, it says that it recognizes the concerned impacts of climate change impacts women and men differently because of the historical and current gender inequalities and other multidimensional factors that can become more pronounced in developing countries and for local economies, communities, and indigenous people. So the fact that you're a woman, you will be impacted by climate change, but these other areas will also increase the impact, and you'll also be impacted differently. And the other area that the UNFCCC recognizes is that while it acknowledges that it is a common concern for mankind, it also needs to there is also a need for countries to see uh, that other, how climate change impacts a person's right to health, other human rights, local communities, children, and in particular, gender equality and empowerment of women, and obviously intergenerational equality as well. So here we're talking about there's a need to have an intersectional lens across the board when we're looking at climate change. So recently I came across this material, which I'd like to present here, which I find it very important to look at when we're looking at, looking at climate change with a gender lens. And it's the idea that there are four basically barriers that need to be considered when we're looking at climate change. And the first barrier is the normative barrier. That is, the general norms and social cultural perceptions which shape, a female's role in public and private spaces. And these norms basically, again, because of the cultural, understanding of what women should do and what women shouldn't do, they then influence the participation and contribution of women in livelihood-related activities as well. So when we're talking about this, there's also, there is uh, when climate change is then generally considered, once again, we say that it's not is considered to be gender agnostic, and there is a need to take this direction forward. And with that, we have to remember that women, marginalized genders, and vulnerable communities will often bear the brunt of climate disasters as well. So uh, overall, uh, if we say that there are two types of climate change events, acute and chronic. So the acute events are usually disasters and one-off, events that occur. So in these extreme events, women will be more, uh, marginalized, let's say, in the way that they are impacted. On the other side, gender inequality will, translate into um, how they're able to access or address the way they're impacted by climate change in the longer run. And when we're doing that, we have to remember that um, in a normative barrier, women would generally, even if they're a livelihood earner, it would take them a longer time to turn around because, and get themselves together because of the different other responsibilities that they have within the households and within the community and, all of that. So it's important to remember when we're looking at that there is the starting off point is the normative barrier. Um, so the other barrier that we need to remember is the structural barrier. There is, because of, our, different roles, there's an unequal distribution of wealth and opportunities. On the agricultural side, while women do work on the land, they only own about 10 to 20% of it. So in the times of disasters, this will impact women differently. Other structural barriers, in terms of the roles that women play, when their women generally are involved in the kitchen or in charge of the indoors, let's just say indoor spaces. So when we're looking at uh, heat waves and higher temperatures, there is that impact on air pollution, and that translates into a disproportionately impacting women's health as well. Uh, Another thing that we should be aware of is that in heat waves, in the urban areas, women will be mostly impacted by indoor heat, while in the rural areas, because of the different roles, it would probably be the opposite because women do play a role in fetching water and on the land as well. So these are both, other structural barriers as well. Capacity barriers, in general, because of a limited access to knowledge, information, training, and innovation and technologies, these limitations do hinder a women's ability to adapt and build resilience. So this area needs to be also considered in any sort of interventions that are being looked at related to climate change. And then finally, decision-making barriers. So women are underrepresented in decision making in both the public policy space and in the private sector. We see that in our numbers as well. Uh, Currently, our female labor force participation stands at 22%, but in the formal private sector, it's even lower, it's around between 3 and 11%. So, and then when we look up in the leadership positions, these numbers get extremely low. So this lack of representation reduces their influences on climate-related programs and policies. And so when we're looking at intervention, we need to sort of try and get more women in those rooms where these decisions are made so that we can get, you know, sort of a more diversity of thought and sort of identify the impacts that women are facing in relation to climate change. So they're also considered when making, the obviously the game plan or the action plan. So just going to end here and uh, hand over to the experts here with a food for thought. And this is just something that I picked up from you at UNEP. So women have, been playing roles in climate adaptation, disaster preparedness, and response. Is basically because of the different roles that they're, thrust into. They do end up managing those roles as best they can, but we need to now ensure that they have these four structural barriers that we're seeing. These are also considered so that women can play a more, a positive role and more, a role that, that has a more, greater substance and that will impact them in a more positive way as well. So just handing over back to Safia now.
Thank you so much, Nazish. And once we move on in the webinar, you'll see that the Climate to Equal project also aims to somehow address these barriers, particularly the structural and decision-making barriers, because those are sort of addressed in the pledges that our companies make. I'd like to now hand over to Francesca, who looks at gender and climate at the IFC. Fran has been with us through the first cycle of the project as well, and I guess we'd all be learning a lot from her presentation today. Over to you, Fran.
Thanks a lot, Safia. I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. Just a moment. Okay,
We
can you
can
give
see
me a
your
thumbs
screen.
up? Okay, great. So hi everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm dialing in from London, so it's nice and early for me here in London, and I know it's midday for you. So nice to be connected. So I think Nazish already set quite a strong background. So I'll try to build as much as possible on her remarks and add to what she's said. Just for some additional context, so I've been with IFC for about 3 years, but was previous at the World Bank for 5 years. So, but always been focused on looking at essentially the social dimensions of climate transition. So, how are we supporting and financing the social impacts related to climate change, and then also creating essentially new opportunities where they may have not existed before through climate finance, through climate-related jobs. So this is really what I look at every single day, and it's been a pleasure to work on this topic because I find it so fascinating just how these things come together if you start to kind of break down the data and the evidence for this area. So I'm going to be just covering a few points. I'm going to be focusing more on the business case and why as corporates we should be considering this gender and climate nexus, or why we should be looking at inclusion in the context of climate change more broadly. And also go through some brief design principles and a case study. I think the best way to demonstrate this is really to walk through a really concrete example. And I'll try to focus my time on that since Nazish has already given a great background on the issue. So I'll go through this really quickly, but I think it's still helpful to get kind of frame this issue, right? So we've spent a lot of time on trying to understand what is the private sector kind of rationale for looking at this. And we've kind of identified three key reasons or ways that gender and inclusion and climate change really intersect. The first one is, as Naj just rightly pointed out, is that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So when we think of natural disasters, changes in precipitation, droughts, rising sea level, what we often find when we look at those kinds of climate events, that women tend to bear the brunt of those disasters because they don't have as much access to financial resources. They have less access to information. They may not, they may be constrained in moving due to social norms. So these things all intersect. So when you have a disaster or you have a change in climate patterns, this is really affecting women to a greater extent. The second dimension, and this is, I think, more on the private sector side, is when we think about kind of new opportunities that are likely to arise in climate transition. So we're talking about new climate-related technologies, cleaner technologies, new jobs, new entrepreneurship opportunities, new access to finance. These kinds of spaces are likely to produce fewer opportunities for women, and I'll show you a few graphs that really demonstrate that. And then the third one, which is actually really, really important, is that we really can't, as societies decarbonize and also adapt to the impacts of climate change without looking critically at everyone, right? So women represent half the population, and so really, really critical that we are creating new opportunities and benefit sharing with women and men to be able to actually transition communities, businesses, people in order to adapt to climate change and also reduce global carbon emissions. So I think Nazish covered this really well, so I'll actually just skip this one, but just maybe pointing out one data point on this first dimension, the disproportionate impact of climate change on women. There's a really great study that really highlights this really, really front and center. And it was published by the FAO last year, and it found that a 1-degree increase in long-term average temperatures, so this is, rising temperatures as a result of climate change, is actually associated with almost a third of income reduction for female-headed households relative to men-led households. And why is that, right? It's because this study was looking at households dependent on agriculture. So a lot of women are represented in subsistence agriculture, and if there's a drought or if there is a climate event, a climate shock, flooding, they are more impacted because they have less access to farming technologies, they have less access to financial services to recover from a climate shock, they have less access to information, and so they're hearing about a climate risk much later than some of their counterparts, and this is why they have such a big impact in terms of their household income as a result. On this second kind of perspective, which is really looking at the opportunities that are arising in climate transition, I find this graph is really kind of demonstrative here. So essentially what this graph is showing is, if you're looking at the dark green bars, this is women's representation in leadership, right, at the sector level. So you see on the left side, NGOs, education, well-being, healthcare. These are all sectors where women are more represented. And then if you go into the right side of the graph, you find sectors like supply chain and transport, energy, manufacturing, and infrastructure. And we find that there's a direct inverse relationship between women's leadership and where climate finance is flowing, right? So if you look at the lighter green bars that are really concentrated on the right side of the graph, you see that climate finance is really flowing into sectors where women are least represented. And this is not unexpected, right? We wouldn't really expect climate finance to flow into education as much as it flows into infrastructure, energy, transport. But the bad news is that these sectors are really unattractive to women in terms of their employment, in terms of their leadership. And so this is something that is a risk to women's economic participation, is that these sectors are growing, are transforming, but they're not necessarily creating new opportunities for women. On this dimension, just a few indicative statistics here. I think it's always helpful to look at these. I mean, I just covered employment, renewable energy. You know, we have 32% women in renewable energy sector versus 68% of men. When we look at VC funding, venture capital funding, I know this is a really small slice of kind of global capital, but it's critical. If we think about disruptive climate technologies, this is how it's being funded, right? These are next generation disruptive solutions, and just 2% of VC dollars globally flow to women-led businesses, 2%. So almost a negligible amount, right? CEOs, women still vastly underrepresented in business leadership. When we look at COP28 leaders, the big global climate conference that happens annually, women 10% of the world leaders represented. And then also in climate science. So if we're thinking about, again, the kind of next generation of climate science, which is critical to informed policy making, to informed business decision, women are really underrepresented. And that doesn't just, that's not even just bad for gender equality. It's also about the fact that you don't have women kind of designing or thinking about solutions that work for women, right? So climate change affects everyone. We need targeted solutions for communities, for different stakeholders. And so those perspectives are missing, which means we are often designing solutions that don't work for everyone. And this is really important. And then the third dimension, so I think this is always really, really interesting to look at. It's really the idea that you need to bring women into more decision making around climate action. And just a few indicative studies here. These are all European studies. I will caveat that there hasn't been any literature in other markets, but it's super interesting that companies are finding that if there's more gender diversity, so there's more representation of women in leadership, they actually do better in terms of climate performance. And what is climate performance? It just means that a corporate, a business, is looking at climate change as a critical and material risk and opportunity to business. So they are setting decarbonization strategies, they're dedicating funding to those strategies, they are trying to reduce their water use, their reliance on polluting fuels. I mean, these are the kinds of activities that companies are doing. Those increase when you have more women in leadership. And why is that? It's not because, women are inherently more green or care more about climate change. That may or may not be true on the individual level, right? But it's actually more about the fact that corporates just make better decisions. And we see that over and over again, that if you have diversity in your leadership team, you're making better decisions, you're more innovative, you have better financial performance. And so that kind of business case is really being extrapolated now to climate related decisions. So if I were to summarize all of that, and I'm going to try to wrap up and move to the case study, because I think it's actually the most interesting. I want you to just go on a little thought experiment here, just for a moment, right? So we've developed this kind of theory of change. So if you imagine on this y-axis, you have climate impact. So from low impact to high impact. And then on the y-axis, you have gender impact, meaning you're addressing gender inequalities from low to high. And so under this first scenario, you imagine a future where we are really focused on climate change. We are putting all of our government and private sector resources into addressing the climate crisis, but we don't address any gender inequality gaps, right? What we would expect to find is a threshold of impact. For all the reasons I just laid out, we can only address climate change to a certain extent without also thinking about the women's roles and women's differentiated impacts as a result of climate change. On a second scenario, imagine a world where we are fully addressing gender inequalities. We're really focused on this as institutions and as governments and private sector, but we fail to look at climate impact, right? We fail to address climate change. again, we would find that there's a threshold of impact. We can only get so far, again, for the same reasons I've already outlaid, right? We're unable to really address gender gaps without also looking critically at climate change. And then you have this third perfect scenario where you're really looking at sustainability holistically. As a corporate, you are considering your gender, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're also looking at climate. You're looking at these material risks to your business, and you're integrating them in a way that makes sense for your business, right? We would expect to see much more effective and much faster impact from both a climate and inclusion perspective. And of course, this is our theory of change, right? We need a lot more data. We need a lot more evidence to substantiate this. And also, this looks different for every business and every type of institution, right? But maybe then to just summarize the kind of business case, why do this as a business? You have a lot of other things to prioritize, right? And this is hard to do, and hard to identify the entry points as well. So I think just to summarize, there's kind of 5 key stakeholders that we look at: women in leadership, women as employees, women as entrepreneurs, women in your community. So if you're operating in a particular community, women are in that community, and women as customers. So this is who you're selling or providing your services to. And so, as I've already covered, increasingly bringing women into leadership can lead to better decision making in terms of your climate performance, and it can also drive innovation. So it can drive problem solving at the corporate level. As employees, a big area of interest for us has been looking at women's participation in green jobs. So this is for companies, renewable energy companies, or any other transport companies, or you're transforming your business to be more climate adapted and also to reduce carbon emissions. So how can you pull women into the workforce, and what are the business benefits? So we see this on several fronts, right? It can help address talent shortages, and you can also gain from workforce diversity. There's a long-standing business case on having more women represented in your workforce, that it encourages innovation, efficiency, and financial performance. Women as entrepreneurs, this may not be relevant for everyone on the call, but if you are a corporate who has large supply chain, so you're sourcing materials, you're sourcing from other businesses downstream, you are likely to confront increasing climate risks, right? So when a disaster strikes, there is a material business risk to your supply chain. So you can actually build more resilient supply chains. And oftentimes what we see, in particular in the agricultural sector, is that downstream there are many women in your supply chain. So how can you actually make them more resilient and decarbonize and make your supply chains more resilient? To actually enhance your climate risks, or address climate risks for your business. And then women in communities. So this is really about having a social license to operate. So if you're a business operating in a community, sometimes you need buy-in from the community to operate. So engaging women in that process can enhance your social license to operate. And then women as customers. So, they represent a new customer segment. So if you are an electric vehicle company or a solar company or a recycling company, it's actually, women actually represent a new stakeholder group for you in terms of customers to sell or offer products and services to that help them become more climate resilient or address climate change in their day-to-day lives. So, I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly in the interest of time, but we kind of see, if this is so great, why are we not doing this more systematically? Why don't businesses look at gender and climate more critically? And the reason is because there's huge knowledge gaps, right? So part of this program is about kind of raising awareness of this intersection, coming together as a community to learn from each other. How can we do this? What can we implement? What's impactful? And so this is really important, and this is a key value addition of the program. And then also identifying concrete actions, right? We can very easily point to something short term, but actually sustaining that and bringing it into your core business model is much more challenging. And that brings me to the last point, organizational change. It's hard to change businesses. It's very, very, very hard, right? So how can we integrate this in a way that's going to sustain and that is, something that the company is interested in, that's going to sustain the efforts over time. So some guiding principles, where to start. And I think the program will really help to kind of flesh this out much more. But I think the first piece is generating data. A lot of companies don't even know where to start because there's no data. They don't know how many women are in their leadership or how many women are in their workforce or their supply chains or how many women they're selling their products and services to. So understanding where the gender gaps exist is step number one, right? And that could be the most fundamental change that you make is just starting to track that kind of data. And then engaging women, right? Including women's perspectives, whether that's in leadership or in your communities that you operate in, this is really essential. And then something that can also help is developing a theory of change. So I think there's probably going to be a whole session on kind of thinking through your commitment and then how you are building that out into very actionable and logical a framework that helps you implement that commitment. So I'm going to just end with sharing a success story study, and I think this is really demonstrative. And so this is an IFC investment. So we actually invested in this company, and they were really kind of leaders in the space in terms of inclusive climate business. They're a leading South Asian automotive company, so they sell cars and three-wheelers and also motorcycles. And they were essentially expanding, the investment was helping them expand into the electric vehicles three-wheeler space. So these are essentially three-wheelers that, you can be self-driving. And essentially the kind of three areas that we focused on as part of the investment was really around encouraging women to buy and operate these electric three-wheelers. And so the company actually offered affordable financing and leasing options to women. They also demonstrated the lower cost of ownership and ease of driving for women. So really got their buy-in to purchase these kinds of vehicles. And then they also provided training programs for women to actually operate and maintain these electric three-wheelers. And this was kind of a three-pronged approach to increase the ownership for women. And so they also committed to some really impactful kind of internal things as well. So they set a target internally at the firm to increase women's representation from 0% to 12%. So actually having women be part of the operations, maintenance of these electric three-wheelers. And then also building a pipeline, so upskilling these women so that they would be able to work in the business for years to come. And really also graduate to more senior positions. And so what was the result is they actually were able to build really strategic partnership with financial institutions like IFC to make accessible in their communities. And they also doubled the penetration rate of EVs in the targeted area. So by selling to women, they doubled the number of owners in terms of these EVs. So huge impacts in terms of their bottom lines. And again, this was core to their kind of business strategy, right? It was not a nice to have off the side gender intervention. It was really core to their whole business strategy. And so, again, just to kind of emphasize the business impact, right? This is all nice to have. What is the business impact? They were able to sell more than 100,000 electric three-wheelers, or their goal is to sell more than 100,000 by 2028. And they've really increased, they're expecting to increase their penetration rate from 5% to 50% in target markets. So this is huge, right? Huge impacts. Women's economic empowerment. So as I mentioned, they are really integrating gender perspective into their workforce. And then they are also really a market leader now. They are recognized in this market in the South Asian country as a leader for electric vehicles and as a leader attracting more women into their business because they are providing such robust kind of gender related focus in terms of their employment, leadership, and how they're marketing their products and services. So I think that's it. I'm going to pass over to Safia now to take you through the program. Over to you, Safia. Do you want me to continue sharing the slides, or do you want me to stop sharing?
You can stop sharing. I'll share from my end just so it's easier. And thank you so
Okay.
much, Fran. Okay. Thanks, Fran, for covering a lot of these things in detail. So when I go over the overview for the Climate2Equal platform and what it looks like, you will all see that a lot of the things that Fran talked about, essentially creating a business case and then having women in decision-making roles, having women in green jobs, that is what we sort of covered through this program as well. So the Climate2Equal project or the peer learning platform was created so that companies could essentially focus on in improving and undertaking more women in their climate action. It was also a way for companies to learn from one another. And that's why we call it a peer learning platform. We host workshops, we host webinars with the companies, and through a series of engagements. So it's a 12 to 18-month engagement. And a lot of companies attend, like when they attend the workshops, we work on their pledges together. We have calls, and we've seen that the project, companies that signed up for the project, were able to make impact in whatever areas they pledged in. So essentially, when a company signs up for the Climate2Equal platform, they make a pledge in a certain area, or they can make multiple pledges. And the idea is that by the end of the program, you've done enough work to say that your pledge was complete. So the pledges are made in the following areas. There's a pledge on representation, so essentially increasing women in the company's climate action. This means like having women design some of the initiatives that take place, having women be in the role where bigger decisions are being made. This it also We can also take this back to Nazish's point where she talked about decision-making barriers. So this sort of caters to that part, adding more women in your company's climate action initiatives, making sure they have a voice that is heard at the table. And we've noticed in Fran's slides as well that when you increase this representation, you see bigger impact on your business. You see that there's a better business case. You essentially also achieve your sales targets, just like we saw in the case study that Fran presented. Then the other pledge category is green jobs. This one focuses on basically developing programs where women can learn skills through internships, training programs, where they can also sort of transition to green jobs, and even if they're performing their current roles, maybe they can take up a role in the sustainability council or the ESG council of a company. So essentially, this particular pledge focuses on that. Then we have data collection. Data is essential to finding out what the issues are, right? If you've never collected your data, if you've never seen what the impact of your operations is in the communities you operate in, you would never find out any of that. And essentially, what doesn't get measured is never reported. It's never talked about. And sometimes we assume that everything's perfect, but when you actually collect data, you'll see a whole other side. So data collection is something that we encourage companies to work on. It can also be a starting point, like Fran mentioned, if the company is really interested in making gender and climate action as a business case or a business strategy. So data collection is essentially the first point. And I'm happy to share that one of the companies, our winning company actually, Packages, did a lot of work in data collection, and they basically gave us a lot of figures and statistics. We'll be calling them in for another webinar at some point, so I'm not going to give away all that information because I would like you all to come back and listen to that one as well. The last category is awareness raising, and in awareness raising, we saw a lot of companies went out to schools. They went out to they wrote. We saw that one company, in particular, National Foods, they wrote a storybook about gender and climate. So we saw that companies did internal and external awareness raising. One of the companies made this app for testing air quality, and that basically helped their workers come to work and protect themselves by wearing masks or having that proper safety mechanism in place. So we've noticed a lot of good practices that came out of this platform, and one of the reasons why I'd encourage companies to join is because this is still an emerging area. We can all learn from each other. We can bring up more innovative solutions. And I think Fran has probably covered this in detail, but I'd just like to touch upon some of the objectives of the platform. It is essentially to increase awareness, increase knowledge, and have examples from our local communities about gender and climate. And in particular, there's very little data from Pakistan. So signing up to this project helps us bring out that data. It also helps build your capacity. It helps you make your pledges and essentially get enough work done in this particular area. And the pledge is just a small like starting point. You can obviously work your way ahead after you've completed your pledge. And then also position yourself as leaders in this area, because again, it's a very new area. When you sign up, you'll automatically be doing a lot more than your peers. So this is a good starting point, essentially. And then advancing the participation of women in your workplace and in your business-led climate action. It's also a very good way to ensure your inclusivity targets are also being met, while also making sure that your company is, doing well in climate action, because we all understand that the risk that, climate change poses is massive, and bringing together all stakeholders on the table is essential. I would now like to hand over to Karishma. I will be displaying her slides, so I'm going to stop sharing my presentation and over to you, Karishma.
Thank you, Nazish. Hello and assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Francesca and a presentation being shared. Sophia, is that? Perfect. And it is truly an honor to be, speaking with you all here today about a topic that is not just close to my heart, but also, deeply relevant in the communities where I work and where I'm from, the intersection of gender and climate change. And while Francesca and Nazish have, given wonderful data, we also need to understand what the situation is at grassroots, because, it's both interconnected. And I really hope that the people that are attending today are not just particularly women, because we're discussing women issues, because this is sort of what rolls around in places like my communities, where we do something where there's a discussion revolving around women. There's more attendees that are women than men, but we must understand. And then usually when the discussion revolves around climate change or community development, it's mostly men, but these are both interconnected, and we must all emphasize on the importance of empowering women to tackle climate change. Now, if we go to the next slide, just a small introduction about myself. My name is Karishma Ali, as you know, and I come from Chitral, and I'm a footballer, but I'm also the founder of Karishma Ali Foundation, where we work to empower young girls through sports. But we also provide a safe platform where girls can learn leadership skills, and are also aware of information that they probably do not possess otherwise, such as information on climate change, and any other information that they do not have access to because they come from, rural areas within Chitral. Now, you might be thinking what, a footballer is doing here talking about climate change, but coming from Chitral, a beautiful yet a deeply vulnerable region in the north of Pakistan, I have personally witnessed the devastating impact of climate change on my community. And, as you know, that our community just heavily depends on natural resources, but we are surrounded by these massive glaciers that are melting at an alarming, rate, which of course leads to GLOB, which is a glacier lake outburst, flood, and the loss of livelihood and all of that. Now, for me, I think what was alarming is when I realized that my community, the way we live during summers now revolves around when the floods come and when there is disaster impact. So it really has changed our lifestyles. That also means, the crops, and when people collect the crops, and how people now plan their lives. It's completely evolved because of climate change. I'd like to go to the next slide, Safia, because before I dive into the discussion, I just want to share some alarming statistics, and these are from the UN, especially from UN Women. We know that by 2050, if the climate change continues at the same rate, close to 160 million women and girls globally may be pushed into poverty due to climate change. And compared to men, women and children are 14 times more likely to die due to climate change. Now, these are alarming statistics, and these are not just, numbers, but they represent real lives, real struggles, and real injustice. And as you mentioned earlier, that we do not have enough data from Pakistan, so it would be much actually worse in Pakistan if we're talking about the stats. And 80% of the people that are displaced due to climate change are women. Now, we can imagine, it's quite alarming if we say 80% that are displaced are women, yet we do not involve women in decision making. We do not involve them in the table where the climate action is being discussed, but also, while we highlight this as these struggles of women and the real injustice, we must also highlight that there is actually a really good opportunity if we integrate the gender lens into climate action. We could actually change these realities. So while we speak about the challenges women may face due to climate change, later on I will also speak about the opportunities and that women create to fight climate change, and how women are actually a powerful agent in the fight against climate change. So I'd like to go to the next slide, Sophia, to address why should we discuss, why should gender and climate be considered together? And I think Francesca and Nazish have explained this in detail already, but we need to understand that Pakistan is now ranked amongst the most vulnerable countries to climate change. But we also know what is true that Nazish mentioned was that Pakistan is also in the it's actually the second worst country when it comes to the global gender index, actually leaving us behind, Somalia. So you can imagine the kind of challenges that women will face, if this is the reality now. In future, what is the situation going to be for women in Pakistan? Women's livelihood, of course, also explained earlier that 80% of the world's food, especially in the developing countries, is produced by women, right? And then they also do not own the land that they have. So that means with climate disasters, these are actually extremely climate sensitive, agriculture and livestock. If that is vanished, that means that that takes away their income, right? That income, and that just makes them even more vulnerable in these situations. And of course, with floods and with all these disasters, we have now, women have increased burden of care work. That means that when disasters strike, women take on extra responsibilities, caring for children, the sick, elderly. But also we need to understand that this unpaid labor makes them, of course, increasingly more vulnerable and limits their ability to seek education and further employment or, leadership roles. We have also one case recently when we were highlighting stories of young girls in Chitral and how they are being impacted by climate change. We had a story of a young girl, Naima. Now, Naima, what happened to Naima was that her safe path to school was washed away by the floods last year. This means that her path that was probably 10 minutes to school has now increased to 30 minutes. What that does is that she has now to go on a path that is diverted away from the village, which is unsafe. That means for 30 minutes, she is actually extremely vulnerable to harassment potentially. But also at the same time, it is a concrete road that leads to her school. That means in summer, she has to walk on the concrete road that will, of course, affect her health. So, in these situations, for Naima, of course, she's extremely resilient and she's fighting for her education. But many of the times, young girls actually opt out of school and they stop their education because it's not safe for them. And we do not look at climate change through these lenses. And that is exactly why, if we go to the next slide, Sophia, we integrated our project, the Game Changers for Climate Justice football camp. And of course, our organization was initiated to empower young girls through football, but we focus on the holistic development of the girls. And of course, since the girls that we're working with are from the north, that is a highly sensitive area to climate disasters, we thought it's incredibly important for girls to get knowledge on climate change. There is a lot of data. UNICEF, I think UNDP has also conducted some research where they have concluded that young people don't think that climate change is an urgent issue. And this is true also from my experience of working with around 500 girls. I think only 2 of them at the time actually had the basic knowledge of climate change and what it is doing. But even they were not as concerned as they should be if they know the reality of climate change. And this is why we started to integrate climate change as part of our project. If we go to the next slide, just to talk a bit more about the initiative, we organized a 6-day football camp with a 1-day tournament. But of course, the program was designed to blend sports and climate education, to build resilience and teamwork and leadership skills among the young girls. One of our programs was, of course, to teach the girls on storytelling. So, for instance, when there is no media that can reach out to their villages when they are facing these catastrophic climate change disasters, how can they tell their stories through social media and share what is happening on ground? That was one part of it. Another part of it was, of course, like how the kind of actions that they could develop for their local communities. And it was, we were actually really surprised that the girls actually built teams during the project, and they came up with really brilliant ideas. And one of them was Eco Pioneers. There is the group of 6 young girls from Buni that have started to now educate other young kids from within their communities on what climate change is and what is happening. And when the flood comes, that it is not all the myths that the people discuss in the villages, but it's actually real signs of why it's happening and how it's happening, and for them to understand and advocate for a better future for themselves. So, this project showed us something extremely powerful, is that when young women actually are given the knowledge and skills to become leaders in a platform, they actually become leaders in their communities, and they want to actually take the initiative. Now going to the last slides, of course, concluding how corporates can include more women in climate action. And I think Francesca has already spoke about this in detail and shared wonderful stats. But I think the stats, let's say, for instance, of green jobs, fewer women having opportunities in green jobs could be actually, again, much worse. We don't have enough data in Pakistan, could be much worse in Pakistan. So as we understand that women are, powerful agent of change and against climate solutions. And then we also earlier discussed that women are responsible, especially in developing countries, producing 80% of the food. And, there's wonderful examples in this slide. If you see, this is one of the many examples of what women are doing in Pakistan. There's a picture of CarbonWise, which is Pakistan's first ever carbon footprint calculator. And this is actually was made by a young girl in Pakistan. And I met her earlier last week, and she was discussing how they're having an extreme problem in raising funds, because again, she's young, she's a woman, so she finds it extremely hard to get into the market and raise enough funds to actually work on this app even more. But there's so many more wonderful initiatives like that, whether it's grassroots initiative like myself or many other young people, especially young women, that are actually addressing climate change in their communities and finding sustainable solutions. But the problem is that there is a huge, bias, within our community. First of all, of course, because it's culturally, we're meant to believe that women are not part of the solution, but women are somehow just part of the problem that needs to be solved, and somehow they always need saviors. This is not true, and that is why what happens is that corporates is, of course, as we look at scaling solutions, one of the biggest opportunity lies in corporate involvement, because that is where all the money is, and so that is where all the power is. They hold the power to actually accelerate climate change, and then involving women in climate change. I believe in investing in women-led climate solutions, that corporate must fund grassroots initiatives, smaller initiatives, but also invest in women entrepreneurs developing climate smart, apps or renewable energy solutions or disaster preparedness innovations. I think what is also really, really important, and this is something we lack, as you said, that companies don't collect enough data is when companies are coming up with these developing gender responsive climate policies for within their companies, or also within the products that they're launching or the project that they're launching, it is incredibly important that companies must conduct impact assessment before launching these climates, because otherwise your initiative is just out there impacting only a fraction of the community and leaving half of the population behind. So it's actually really important when designing sustainability projects that ensure that women's voices are included from the start and not after you realize that you have created some mistake. And lastly, of course, create opportunities for women in green jobs. And, climate action should not just be about policy, it should also be about economic opportunity. And corporates should prioritize hiring and training women in green industries such as solar industry, which is actually rising in Pakistan, sustainable agriculture, and disaster risk management. If you go to the north, of course, we realized that less women are involved in the risk management when it comes to blow off alert or response, being responsive to these disasters. Women are not likely involved in these trainings. And so I just want to, close my discussion and leave this thought that climate action without gender inclusion is incomplete. And when we empower women and girls in climate solution, we're not just reducing their vulnerabilities, but we're also unlocking their potential as leaders, as innovators, as change makers. And we're actually building a resilient community. And so, we know from our discussion and of course from all the news that we are hearing that the urgency of climate crisis demands that we act collectively. And I hope we can leave here, committed to integrating gender perspective into all the policies that you're making from within your communities, the programs that you're designing, and recognizing that when we, empower women and girls, we're actually empowering an entire community. Thank you so much. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Karishma. I think towards the end, you beautifully summed up what we're talking about, not just in terms of gender and climate action, but also essentially what the Climate2Equal platform aims to cover as well. This is one of the reasons why we're pushing for women-led climate action from the corporate side, because we see the corporate sector as this positive, progressive, space that still needs to do so much more in this area. Now, I think we can open the floor to any questions that you may have. Please feel free to drop in your questions either in the chat box or either in the Q&A option. Also, I've just shared a link in the chat box for the fee for our signing up to Climate2Equal. I'm also going to display a slide where you can use the QR code to scan and fill out the feedback form, as well as if you want to sign up for Climate2Equal. Let me just send the message out in a second. Are there any questions? You can also use your mic if you want. Okay, we have a question from Fatima Afzal. The question is, are there any training programs to increase C-suite executive awareness and understanding about climate and its impact on women? Nazish, would you like to take the question?
Hi. So uh, we basically the renewed action program in which we have a couple of workshops, and that is basically to increase the awareness of the private sector about climate and its impact on women. Other than that, what happens is when through their pledges, companies can implement this sort of pledge to increase the C-suite awareness of C-suite executives about understanding the impact of climate and and especially on women as well, and why there's the importance of the role to do it. If you Other than that, there are a lot of training programs available online as well. You do see them on Coursera coming up on gender and climate, and also the UNFCCC has a couple of other of them as well. Our webinars are basically now being um, obviously, then there's a next webinar which will have a company on board as well to see how they have implemented this this awareness raising program as well. So, we'll be doing these. We have a lot, a plan in place for the next year to do a lot of these. So, feel free to reach out, and we'll be sharing them when these happen. Right.
Thanks, Nazish. There's also another question from Asma Zehra. How can women themselves work for climate change? Karishma, would you like to answer this since you work in that area?
Yeah, Sophia. So I think to begin with, it's incredibly important to increase your knowledge. And as Nazish mentioned, that there are courses out there that you could do, but there's also plenty of information out there on the internet that you can gain to actually deeply understand the topic. And once you do, I think it's really important to get into the discussion of climate change and involve yourself in one way or another. And it can be as small as advocating for climate change from within your families and within your friends group. It doesn't have to be something massive. And then, of course, if you want to create a bigger change, then wherever you're working, understand the policies of your companies, and then try to integrate more sustainable methods, or encourage your company to integrate more climate-friendly projects.
Thank you, Karishma. Now we have a question in the Q&A box from Naila Sajjad. It says, are there any plans to work with boys and men or role reversal? Naila, for the Climate2Equal program, we are open. Obviously the program is open to everyone, both men and women. And we have seen a lot of companies where there were a lot of men who took initiatives, made the pledges, and did the work. So these programs are not restricted to any gender. We are open to working with everyone. And Nazish, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. The idea is when we look at role reversal, we generally do it in our gender sensitization sessions, and we do talk about addressing that. Perhaps, we ourselves, when we do our gender sense, we could do as a pledge by CERB, we could look at role reversal in the sense that when we do our gender sensitization sessions, we bring in a little bit of gender and climate into that as well. But that's generally covered in gender sensitization.
Okay, we have another question for Karishma. It says, have you received any meaningful help from the district administration government? And if there's a platform mechanism that really help facilitate women-led resilience at the grassroots level, and how has your experience been?
Thank you for the question. Just to begin with, there is very little or no support from, at least I haven't received any sort of support from the government or any local district administration so far. Are they encouraging of the work that we do? Yes. What I believe, the biggest problem in today's time, and especially in Pakistan, is that we are taken to places and celebrated as heroes, and our stories are heard, but then the support does not come in, right? So we're made as this like poster child of women empowerment and climate solution. But then there is, when you look at the reality, there is little or no sort of investment into the project or the work that we're doing. And there is actually people doing much greater work than I am doing. We're doing it at a very small scale. This is a problem, and finance is a big problem. But also, secondly, I think there is no real. What the government needs to do is they need to probably create a directory of all the organizations and movements that are being that are actually fighting against climate change or any other issues. There is a big gap between the government and the local ground work that is being done between CSOs and the government. And I think that gap needs to close to create a conversation together.
Thank you, Karishma, for answering. There is another question. It's about the data already collected against the first cohort, and if we've created a report. Anam, I can assure you we've been working on that, so hopefully very soon you'll be able to see something from our end. But we do have plans of publishing the data that we received from our first cohort. I think we've covered all the questions. Thank you, Karishma, for being here and for Okay, you're welcome, Anam. Sorry, I was just reading the chat box at the same time. Thank you, Karishma, for being here with us today. I think people really learned from your experience and the work that you've done. And truly, it's great to see that you've involved so many women in climate action and also in sports, which is something, another topic of discussion perhaps for another day. But thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Nazish, for taking out the time as well. I think now I'll just end the webinar. If there's any questions, I put my email in the chat box along with the forms and the links, so you can reach out to me on email, and we'd be happy to help your company become a part of Climate2Equal. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, and have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.